Welcome to this ISO Audit Awareness training session for managers. The purpose of this session is to provide you with an understanding of what internal and external ISO audits are, what's involved in the process, what you need to do if involved, and to provide you with tips for dealing with the external certification auditor. However, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, which is the Wurundjeri land. I pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and recognise their continuing connection and contribution to this land. We celebrate the stories, culture and traditions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders of all communities who also work and live on this land. What we're going to cover within this session is what an ISO audit is and general audit practice, including types of audit, guiding principles, audit steps, including objective evidence, audit trails, and audit criteria and audit findings. KFA's process for internal audits, including audit workflow and the corrective action process, the external certification and surveillance audit process and its workflow, and lastly, tips for dealing with the auditor and common audit failures. We start with looking at the definition for an ISO audit and then look at the different types of audits. The steps typically involved in an audit, what constitutes objective evidence, and how this is identified. What types of audit trails are followed, and what criteria the auditor checks against, and what types of findings do they raise. ISO define a management systems audit as a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining objective evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria has been met. Now, there are three different types of audit that can be carried out. The one that we're going to be focusing on today is mainly first party and third party audits. Now, a first party audit is an audit undertaken by an organisation of its own activities against audit criteria. These are usually undertaken by company staff, but may also be undertaken by external resource. And these are also known as internal audits. Second party audits is an audit commissioned by an organisation on its vendors against audit criteria such as a contract, supply code or a standard, and usually in aid of a procurement decision. Again, these may be undertaken by staff from the organisation or external resource, and these are generally known as supplier audits. Thirdly, or the third type is third-party audits, and these are audits carried out by an external certification body against an ISO management system standard with the aim of awarding certification. Certification bodies themselves are accredited to do this by a national accreditation body on behalf of the government and will be members of the International Accreditation Forum, or IAF. And these are known as certification audits. Now, the guiding principles for audits are that they are independent of the people performing the work to ensure impartiality and objectivity. Auditors are qualified in the management system standard being audited against, have experience and relevant technical qualifications as required by the audit discipline. For example, you'd expect someone performing a health and safety audit to have a health and safety qualification and experience in health and safety. All certification bodies are required to operate in accordance with ISO 17021 and are themselves audited by the National Accreditation Body. Within Australia, our accreditation body is JASANS. ANAB is a large American body, and UCAS is the national accreditation body for the United Kingdom. Now, there is a big difference between audits and inspections. Inspections tend to focus on going down a checklist, while audits focus on audit trails and are time dependent. And what we mean by this is that an audit will follow the audit trails during an audit to determine the implementation of a system and the management of risk within the time frame allocated for the audit. Whereas an inspection goes down a checklist until the checklist has been completed. We'll talk a little bit about audit trails a bit later. So audits will focus on regularity and system focused. They are less frequent, but extended length of time. They involve significant preparation and documentation. They examine processes, procedures, and policies, and are conducted by using protocols by a team of experts, and concludes through the preparation of a report for management. Inspections tend to be more visual checks of equipment, physical conditions, behaviours, etc. They're narrower and limited in scope and length of time. They're conducted routinely, often by site staff. Observations are usually around behaviours and physical conditions, and they're usually conducted using checklists. Issues may be corrected on the spot, and inspection procedures themselves may be subject to audits. Now, audit trails. An audit trail is really when the auditors literally following a trail of data and investigations. And the best way to look at it's probably similar to a police investigation, in that you identify an issue, and then from that you're looking at different sources of evidence to support any conclusions that you need to make. And the example we have here is a chemical can was observed by the auditor within a plant room. So the auditor trail they start to follow is they look to see if that chemical's on the hazardous chemical register. And then they can follow two trails of investigation from that. They can look at the safety data sheet to see if there's any storage requirements around that particular chemical. And then they look at what the storage requirements should be for that chemical. Or alternatively, they may then look at, well, which contractor left that particular chemical in the plant room? Did they check into site? Are they pre-qualified? Have they done the induction? And did they get access to critical documents? And again, a third trail may come from that is, was the property risk register made available to them? So some organisations call the audit trails lines of inquiry, especially in the police force. They would use that scenario, but that's really what an audit does. Whereas a checklist, you may look at, are there any chemicals stored in the plant room that shouldn't be there, and that you'd put a cross against that, and then move on. So you wouldn't delve into the whole process of the risks around that item being present. The performance of an audit covers 6 steps, excluding the audit planning activity, opening and closing meetings, and report writing. As a high level, the audit includes gathering objective evidence, evaluating the evidence against set criteria, determining findings against that criteria, whether positive or negative, identifying if there are any non-conformances against the audit criteria, requiring the auditee to take corrective actions to prevent the recurrence of the non-conformances, and then verifying that the actions taken to correct the non-conformances have been effective. And we'll explore these in the following slides. Objective evidence. Objective evidence is simply data supporting the existence or verity of something which are related to the audit criteria. Example can be policies, can be your quality management system manual, they can be procedures, they could be your process map or SIPOC, they can be records, they can be data. So an auditor can look at all of these documented information to provide him with information in terms of whether you're complying with the audit criteria. They also use observation. So it's looking at what is being done. So that could be physically observing a process, and observation in terms of some ISO standards, such as health and safety. Observation is around walking the site so that we can see what's happening in terms of health and safety. As we just looked at that previous audit trail slide, it's around, well, are chemicals being physically stored properly? So it's observation. And the last one is a statement of fact. So it's around you telling the auditor something which turns out not to be true, or you tell the truth and it's the wrong thing. So for instance, you're telling the auditor that we do a process a certain way, but the standard actually requires you to do it differently. So the three areas of objective evidence are documented information, observation, and statement of fact. Now, as we said previously, we then compare the evidence that's gathered against the audit criteria. Now, there can be many forms of audit criteria, but usually it's the relevant ISO management system standards that you claim conformance to. So the standard contains requirements that need to be achieved. So the auditor will be comparing your documented information, observations, and statement of facts to see whether we're compliant with those requirements. It's your own manuals, policies, plans, procedures, process maps, and templates, which in essence are your health and safety system. So if your procedure says you do something in a certain way, that is audit criteria. And depending upon the ISO standard, any relevant legal requirements. For example, health and safety and environmental audits have a high legal basis. And the expectation there is that the audit, and this is why auditors for those areas need technical expertise in the subject area, because they need to know the legal requirements that would apply to a given situation. And lastly, any other requirements that your organisation subscribes to can be audit criteria, such as industry sector codes and customer identified requirements, such as contractual requirements. However, when the auditor makes his conclusion, he must be able to link all of that criteria and the issue that is identified back to the clause of the relevant management system standard. So, for instance, your procedure may say that you do something, but it's not related to health and safety, and you're not doing it, then they shouldn't really be raising that in a health and safety audit. Now, we can make several different findings during an audit, and we're just going to talk a little bit around the different types of finding and the different types of audit that's picked up on. So for ourselves, when we're doing our internal audits, we will have what we call a non-conformity. And basically, we're sorry, conformity is the first one. So for conformity, we're simply making a statement around confirming that the implementation of the requirement has been effective. We use the term non-conformity when there's a non-fulfillment of a requirement. And within internal audits, we may also use the words opportunity for improvement. And it's a statement of fact made by the assessor and substantiated by objective evidence, where we refer to a weakness or potential deficiency in the management system, and it may lead to a non-conformity in the future. I'm just going to jump to the next slide, and we will come back to this because the final bit while I'm looking at internal. And then also there's an observation. And an observation is quite similar to an opportunity for improvement, but it's usually just a statement of fact. In terms of certification audits, they use slightly different approach. If they find everything conforms, so we've got conformity, they recommend certification. They tend to break non-conformities down into two different areas. So they'll have a minor non-conformity. A minor non-conformity is something that doesn't affect the capability of the management system to achieve its intended results. And then the higher category is a major non-conformity. And a major non-conformity is really, it's a breakdown of the management system to achieve its intended results. And a number of minor non-conformities, if they're associated with the same requirement or issue and can demonstrate systemic failure, they can also be raised as a major non-conformity. Again, certification uses the same opportunities for improvement, whereas there's something they're telling us that could lead to a non-conformity, and we suggest that you have a look at that. And then observations, which are just a statement of fact. In terms of actions that happen when we raise these, in terms of the conformity, obviously there's no action required. We conform to the requirements. If it's a non-conformity from an internal audit, we expect the management responsible for the area to take corrective action to address the root cause of the issue, and then the action is reviewed by the auditor to determine whether that action is appropriate and effective. In terms of certification audits, if we have a minor non-conformity, we must provide the certification auditor with a formal corrective action plan within a few days, and they will check that the action we have taken is effective at the next audit. And that actual corrective action plan for the particular certification body that we use has to be uploaded onto their portal. Lastly, if they raise a major non-conformity, we must provide them with a formal corrective action plan around how we're going to correct the cause of the issue, and we must do that within 4 weeks. The auditor will then come back in 4 weeks to review the action taken, and if they cannot close out the non-conformity, then the auditor will recommend, if we've got certificate withdrawal, or on an initial certification, we wouldn't get certified. If we raise an opportunity for improvement in both internal and our certification audits, the management for the area should review and take improvement actions where appropriate. And similar observations, management for the area must review and determine the need to take any improvement action. So the next area I want to look at is just the Knight-Frank internal audit process. So just around our internal audits, and as we go for ISO standards, this will become a regular activity. A key requirement for ISO management system standards is that we carry out internal audits, i.e. first-party audits on the deployment of the management system to ensure it is effectively followed and that it continues to meet the requirements of the ISO standard. And in this section, we will talk about Knight Frank's internal audit process, which applies regardless of whether we are speaking about ISO 9001 for quality or ISO 14001 for environmental or ISO 45001 for occupational health and safety audits. They all follow the same process. So in terms of audit process, health, safety and environmental audits, these are site and legislation-based standards. We do two different methods for these audits. We do what we call remote audits. So these are conducted remotely and usually involve looking at records on our FRC or LMS system, or we ask the particular office to provide the records that we need. It has a very low level of management engagement, and that's because we don't want to tie up people unnecessarily. The second, we don't do as frequently as we would like because there's costs associated with on-site audits. But on-site audits, as it says, are conducted in person and on site. So they may be conducted at the actual corporate office, or they may be conducted on a property or site that Knight Frank manages. On-site audits tend to include a tour of the premises, interviews with staff, review of on-site records, and follow-up on records again off-site. Those type of audits require a high level of engagement from management. In terms of quality internal audits, they're very much, it's a process-based standard. So we don't necessarily need to see the site because we're not looking at legislation that may be based to how sites managed. Again, two different methods. We can do this remotely or in site. Majority we tend to do on an internal audit basis is again remote. We conduct these over Teams. They will involve the people leaders and process owners relevant to that department. And again, includes interviews with staff, sharing of records and documents, review of those documents and records, and review of our resolve system. Requires a high level of management engagement. And similarly, the on-site ones for quality are very similar. It's just that it's conducted actually in the office or on site. Usually we will notify you of the type of audit and our audit notification to everyone, and that should say whether it's going to be remote or on site. The internal audit process follows a distinct workflow. So audits we schedule, and we have a method for doing that, which is documented. And the schedule, once an audit has been done, will be determined on the level of risk. So we find, if we do find that we do the first audit in a particular area and we find lots of non-conformities, that they may get audited every year, where others maybe get audited every couple of years. So we send an email notification out to the auditee who's been identified. At the moment, that's very much a manual process. Resolve doesn't have a notification for the scheduled audits. We are looking at maybe changing that in the future. It's just a little bit of work to do to get the system to do that. We then perform the audit. So whether it's we go out to site or we do it remotely, we perform the audit. We'll circulate a report at the end of that audit, and that's something that the Resolve system does. It generates a report. And we then assign corrective actions at the same time to those people responsible for the management of that area where the audits occurred. And Resolve will actually send an email notification to somebody when a corrective action has been assigned to them. And it will also add an action on your action list in the platform, so it will appear on the dashboard. Once the auditee has corrected his non-conformity, undertaken the action that's been requested, and provided objective evidence to support they've done that action, then the corrective action is reviewed by the auditor and then closed out. Now, corrective actions are assigned, determined on a priority level. So, and the priority level determines how much time is expected to correct that non-conformity. Now, at the moment, as our system is very new, we are downgrading some non-conformities to the level below. So, for instance, we may identify some non-conformities, and then corrective actions required, which really are a high priority. We're actually downgrading those to medium at the moment. But as our system gets more embedded, we will stop that process and we will become more rigid on the expected timing. So what constitutes a high priority? So it's basically a non-conformity that affects the capability of the management system to achieve the intended results, or that exposes the organisation to a high level of risk, such as legal non-compliance. Medium, it's a non-conformity, but it won't stop the management system achieving intended results. And low is really an opportunity for improvement. It's where a potential weakness in the management system, which if we don't improve it, is going to lead to a non-conformity in the future. So that's the gradings we utilise. The next section we're going to talk about is around the certification and surveillance audit process. So certification audits or third-party audits are performed by a certification body that has been accredited by the National Accreditation Service for the relevant country. Now, the certification body that we use is BSI, and they're the same certification body that's used by Knight Frank LLP within the UK. So in this section, we're going to talk about our certification process and why we picked this particular certification body is as well. So we've partnered with BSI to do our ISO certifications. Now, BSI are the world's oldest certification body and are part of the world's first national standards body. So BSI are actually part of, or really what the BSI stands for is the British Standards Institute, but they do keep the assurance certification activities completely separate from their standards body activities. They operate worldwide, and as I mentioned, they're used by Knight Frank LLP. And for me, the most important thing is that certification has global credibility. Whereas if we go to some of the smaller certification bodies within Australia or indeed any other country, they don't have that gravitas, that international global credibility. So where we're dealing with international clients, that extra gravitas will provide Knight Frank in a good place when we're making or we're undertaking tenders. So the certification audit process follows several stages, and then we have an annual activity as well. So stage one is document review. So basically the external certification body, their auditor comes in, looks at the documentation that we have and basically says, yes, you've covered the requirements of the standard. And I can see that you've got a management system that's been in operation for a while and that we can come in and audit that system. So you're in a good place to be audited. The stage two is the certification audit. So they come in and they audit the implementation of that system to check that we are doing what we've said we're going to do. And stage two is the initial certification audit, but we can also add another stage two later on if we want to do what's called an extension to scope. So for instance, we've just got certified for project management for ISO 9001. And if we wanted to add global portfolio solutions into that, it becomes a stage 2 extension to scope assessment. And what that means is they don't need to go back and do the document review because they know that system's there. They're just looking at, have you now deployed that system into that area that wasn't previously deployed in. Once you have certification, then we go into annual surveillance visits. And these are limited audits, they're less time, and the auditors just check in, we're maintaining our system still. And at the end of a 3-year period, you have to do a recertification, which is basically a whole repeat of the stage 1 and stage 2 audit process. And certification audits tend to work in that 3-year audit cycle. So the certification audit workflow. So we do get notification from the auditor of the times that they're going to come and audit us. To be honest, it's usually we've already agreed the dates previously, so it's just them confirming to us those agreed dates. And the people that do that, it will be the HSCC team who work with the external certification body. There is some leeway in dates, but sometimes if you're looking at surveillance audit, there isn't leeway because it has to be done within a certain time frame of your initial certification, usually before the first year. The actual audit process, they'll undertake an opening meeting with senior management involved for that audit area. They will then go out and perform the audit, so they'll visit departments, sites, and gather objective evidence, as we've previously mentioned. And then they will hold a closing meeting with senior management where they present their findings. So from the audit criteria and the audit objective evidence that they've gathered, what are the findings that they're making? So what are their conclusions? So in simple terms, what non-conformities are they going to raise or opportunities for improvement, etc. They then provide a documented report, and that's usually circulated within 1 week of the audit being completed. And then depending on what they're found in the audit system, they then require us to provide them with a corrective action response, and as I said, corrective action plan, which then goes on to their portal. So we'll involve local management in deciding on what that action should be, what's the feasibility of what we can do. We do have to respond quickly to that, as we're only given a couple of weeks to provide that corrective action plan to them. And as I said, if they've raised any major non-conformities, they will close out within 4 weeks to close out that plan. And in which case, we've really only got a few days to respond to them with what our corrective action plan is going to be. So that's how the certification audit process works. Now, I just wanted to give you some tips for dealing with the certification auditor and also talk about some common failures. So I was previously a certification assessor in the previous career. And I can tell you some of the common failures that we come across time and time again with companies. We should have a look at some of those. So I just wanted to start by the different people that will be involved in the external audit process. So we have the auditor. So the auditor will be from BSI, and their responsibility or their involvement is to perform the audit by gathering objective evidence. They will want to go to the place of work where the work is done, and they will ask managers, employees questions, and they will review data, look at screens if that's how we demonstrate to the auditor a workflow or how our process works, because obviously these days we're controlled a lot by applications, computer programs, etc. and they may ask to gather copies of documents. Depending on the audit type, they may bring in what's called a technical expert, and that is an auditor is supported by a technical expert, and that's really for them to bring some context in terms of high-risk industries, so for around standards such as work, health and safety, environmental or information security. Generally, they will also be a qualified auditor, and that used to be my role as a technical expert for health and safety. Internally, we need to provide the auditor with an audit guide. And for our audits, that's going to be a member of the HSSE team. And the role or involvement of an audit guide is to accompany the auditor around, and they will then support if you are not sure on something in relation to the ISO standard or company policies. They're there to assist you, especially if you're not quite 100% clear on something, but they're also there to jump in if we're going down perhaps the wrong path, and to keep us back on track for the audit. But it's also there to witness what the auditor may be raising. And we will sometimes challenge the auditor if we think we have covered it within the standard and the auditor is getting confused, and that can happen. They ensure the audit goes smoothly and the auditor sticks to the timings of the plan, but they won't answer in relation to your activity. We're not going to, if we're looking at something like property management, we're not going to answer questions in terms of, well, how's the lease produced? How's that agreed with the client? That's more around the process, and that's really where the auditee needs to answer. We have our auditee, and that will be the Knight Frank service line manager or process owner, and their role is really to take the auditor through the process, answer questions and show the auditor records, to explain their process, i.e. what do we do in terms of our work, and talk the auditor through the process map, the SIPOC, or any specific policies and procedures that Knight Frank or the department has in relation to their work. Their involvement is to answer questions around competence and resourcing, etc., because the auditor may want to know, how do we determine whether we've got enough resource for that process? And basically to show the auditor how the department and process operates, what we do for our clients. Auditees themselves may have assistants, and that's normally a member of their team, and they may get that person to assist by demonstrating to the auditor how a particular activity and process works. And as we get more and more au fait with certification or audits, quite a lot of companies start putting more emphasis on their employees demonstrating the process rather than just the management. And very much the auditors looking for that eventually. So I just want to talk some simple do's and don'ts when engaging with the external auditor. I think first of all, be positive, and certainly be courteous and cooperative with the auditor. We have to remember they are human, and they can get upset and angry as well. And if they do, they're less likely to work with you and your team on any findings that they raise. It's just human nature. My experience is that a happy auditor may give you the benefit of the doubt. So if it looks like you may not be complying with something and they haven't fully got to the bottom of it, they may say, okay, I'm just putting this as an observation this time. It's something you should really look at. Secondly, stay calm and be open and honest with the auditor and answer their questions as best as you can. And one of the things to be very careful of is don't assume that you understand the intent of the question. Because sometimes auditors have a different thought process from you, and you may be predicting the audit trail that they're going to go down by asking a particular question, and you may be wrong. Having said that, with experience of being audited, you will tend to learn the trails that an auditor may go down from his question. And certainly a lot of the clients I worked with over many years knew exactly the way I thought. So they knew exactly if I answered a particular question, and if they gave me a certain answer, where I would be heading with that. Which is kind of why a lot of certification bodies change auditors within that 3-year cycle. Don't be afraid to ask the auditor for clarification before responding to question. Auditors can tend to talk very much in the language of the standard. When you're training auditors, you do try to get them to start talking more the language of business to translate. But auditors go into so many different industry sectors. So it's good to, if you're not sure, just ask them to re-clarify. So you don't understand, get them to rephrase the question. Auditors are quite happy to do that. Admit when you don't know the answer, and find out if the auditor wants you to try and find the information now or in the future. One of the things I would say to people, if you don't know the answer, don't try to guess, because that drops a lot of companies into a lot of issues where you think, we should be doing this, we probably are doing that, and you tell the auditor we are doing it, and he then goes and finds out later on that we're not actually doing that. Be a sponge, learn from the questions and take notes. Auditing or being audited is always a good learning experience. So it's useful to see what sort of questions the auditors taken. And again, this is why we have audit guides. Quite often in audit, either I'll identify things that the auditor hasn't picked up on. I'm not going to tell him what those things are, but I'll go around and correct those at a later time, or look to see what we can do. One of the things our auditor does quite often, because he knows my background, he'll ask me, what did I think? And I'm always very non-committal to him as to what I think in terms of what he's looked at. Provide concise answers to the auditor. Don't go off into lots of stories and scenarios. Keep the audit his answers short and to the point. And learn to be comfortable with silence. Auditors often wait for people to respond in the hopes that an auditee will feel the need to fill the silence and keep conversation going. And quite often, auditees volunteer information they didn't want to reveal in the silence. And one of the things I used to do as an auditor is use silence quite a lot, and some of the good auditors will do that. Read their body language and mannerisms. One of the things I was always told by, again, some of my clients who I knew for many years, as soon as they used to say to me, as soon as you go, or that's interesting, or you sigh, we know there's an issue. So listen out for those sort of things and ask them, is everything okay? Is there something that we need to be concerned about? Some of the don'ts in terms of engaging with an auditor. I think, first of all, don't get overwhelmed or stressed about the seriousness or complexity of the audit process. You know more about your process most of the time and the industry sector than the auditor. Good auditors will remember what you've told them and use this to check with other people or other information later in the audit. It's kind of like the Miranda rights, that anything you say is taken down and used as evidence. So if you don't know something, don't guess, because otherwise that is taken down as objective evidence. Again, lots of my clients were quite surprised that they tell me something in the opening meeting or in the morning, and I'd remember when we're in a different area what they've told me, and I'd raise questions around it. Some auditors can read upside down, so be careful if you are taking notes. And I have to admit, this is a skill I learned over the years. And one or two clients have got themselves in trouble because I could read their notes upside down that they're making opposite the table from me. When answering, don't go off on a tangent or tell stories. Keep responses on target. This is not the time to throw everything at the wall to see what sticks. So don't volunteer information. Answer only what is asked. Auditors must be free to share whatever they've observed and write them down in a report. You should not be overriding their ideas or dictating to them. Whatever positive or negative is presented in the report, and we have to acknowledge it. And lastly, and I had a colleague who was expert at this, it's a little technique us auditors call the Columbo technique. And if you ever watched the detective program Columbo in the 70s, it was one of his police investigation techniques. Is just before he left the room, he'd turn around and go, I've just got one last question, just as he's walking out the door. And that tends to be the killer question. And I had a colleague who'd say, yeah, everything's fine. Then he'd walk out the door, and just as he's out the door, I've just remembered, just got one more question. And he'd hit you with that killer question. There'd be something he knew full well that we wasn't doing, and he just wanted clarification of that. So just be aware that that can happen. So some of the common ISO certification failures. The standards, all of the standards, are very focused on training. So organizations often fall short in that they cannot provide proof that employees are trained when requested. They cannot access training records. That's a very common one, and we've had that so many times, and it's an easy win for an auditor to identify people who haven't been trained, especially if that training requirement's a legal requirement. Another area is what I call missing management. So again, a key requirement in all of the standards is leadership. So some organizations struggle to gain ISO certification or recertification if the senior management doesn't take ISO seriously. So if they're unprepared or they're missing, it can damage your chances of achieving certification. I once, during a recertification, raised a major non-conformity on a managing director who was meant to be meeting me that morning so I can interview him, but decided he wanted to go off and play golf instead. That company didn't get certification. I did go back later on to close out their major certification, and that ND did make himself available that day. But I've had other MDs or CEOs even who couldn't be available on that day because they had to go off somewhere different, so quite often a different part of the country or even different country, but they'd make time to have a call with me that their people on site would arrange, and we would have a phone call so that I can do the top management interview. So there's ways around these things if you have to be off somewhere and can't actually be there. It's just need to arrange with the person managing the audit, but you'll need to phone into them. Can we have this time slot so you can talk to them? Legal non-compliance. Now this is very much more OHS or environmental standard, but quality can come into this. For example, in property management, we've got some legal requirements around property managers having real estate certification and licensing. So that's something an auditor may raise as a legal non-conformance if they find somebody's operating and hasn't got that license. It's very common within 45,001 and 14,001 environmental audits, and a lot of legal issues can be identified in the audits. And this is one of the strengths of those two standards, and why procurement organisations want you to have it, is they know that you are focusing on legal compliance as part of your management system. Document control. The process for document control is not effective by no clear approvals or change management. Documents that aren't included within the quality management system suddenly turn up that someone's using those documents. Incorrect versions are being used by staff. And this is why we quite often have a central portal and we say to staff, don't save them to your desktop. Each time you need to use something, go to that central portal so you know you're getting the latest version of the document. And don't create documents locally at a management level if they should be part of the quality management system. And I can tell you many years ago, when I got one of my organizations I worked for, ISO 9001 certification, our surveillance audit, a biggest failure we ever had. We had a new manager in the call center, and that particular manager decided to invent lots of his own local documents himself that he wanted his team to follow, and they should have all been included within the quality management system. And in fact, there was documents in the quality management system, if he had bothered asking anyone, that actually contradicted the local ones he'd invented. And we actually came very close to losing our certification that day. Corrective action, ineffective corrective action process. So it's corrective actions are assigned to people that are overdue, they've not been actioned upon by the person they've been assigned to, or the action not addressing the root cause of the non-conformity. Another common areas of failure, and these are two actually being managed by myself and my team. So I'm pretty convinced that we won't get these failures, but internal audit programs not being maintained, audits being overdue, audits not being carried out by people independent of the work, and auditors not having any formal auditor training. Lastly, management review process. So the senior management within our business have to review the management system standards. And generally the failures that tend to occur is you're not covering all of the inputs that are required by the standard, or having the demonstrated outputs in the management review process. Managed records of management review not available, all reviews not carried out at least yearly. And those two themselves would tend to be regarded as major non-conformity. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. Thanks you for listening to this presentation. I hope it's provided you with an insight on how our internal audit process works for the certification audit process. But if you have any questions, please feel free to send them to myself, Paul Trepty, and we'll try to answer those for you as best we can. Thank you.